your book, Why We Remember, argues that forgetting isn't a flaw, but this adaptive feature that came from evolution. Could you expand that and how evolution shaped these traits rather than us trying to aim for precise recall?
Yeah, I think we intuitively think of memory as being like being able to remember stories from our past or something, right? But we have certain abilities that our brain allows us to do, and those abilities aren't there just for fun. They're there because it helped us survive in one way or another, right? And so memory is no different in that sense. Memory helps us get around and figure out where we are. Memory helps us figure out where we should be going to and what we should be doing and who we should be doing it with. And anything else is really clutter. And so the analogy I like to give is, let's say if you're going on a trip, right? You're not going to pack everything you own. You're not going to take those plants that are behind you. You're not going to take the lamp that's behind you. You're not going to take the sofa. You're going to take just what you need for that trip, right? And memory can be thought of as essentially your brain trying to pack for the journey of life. And it's trying to pack the experiences that are most valuable, most useful, most important, and leave the rest behind.
Yeah, it's interesting. So it's almost, as you mentioned, a feature rather than what most people think about, which is brain, cognition going down as we get older. This is kind of just a natural adaptation of our evolution.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, if you look at people who supposedly have a perfect memory, there's people who have what's called highly superior autobiographical memory. And so these are people who you could give them a date like June 7th, 1979, and they could tell you what they had for breakfast. They could tell you who won the sports games that day and what the weather was and so forth. Now, they're not perfect, because if I asked them to just memorize a bunch of Swahili words, they would be just as good as you or me at doing it. So there's nobody who exists who has a truly perfect memory. But even those people with highly superior autobiographical memory, there's no evidence that they're super successful. There's no evidence that they're happier. There's no evidence that they're functioning any better than people who have severely deficient autobiographical memory. And in fact, people who have pretty crummy autobiographical memory, that is memory for their life experiences, those people often report themselves as quite happy because they're in the moment. Whereas like people with highly superior autobiographical memory are constantly burdened by memories that just pop up at inopportune moments. And when something bad happens to them, they just ruminate on it and chew on it for hours or days on end, right? So some people have gone online just to look and see, and some people with this condition describe it as hell, and they say they wouldn't wish it on their worst enemy. Obviously, that's kind of a dramatic take. I'm not sure everybody with HSAM feels that way, but the point is that it's not something that you want necessarily. It's not something that'll give you some superpowers in life.
So this is synonymous or equivalent to someone that has a photographic memory. Is that right?
Well, yeah. So I don't like to use that word photographic memory because it implies somehow that the memory that we have, or whoever has photographic memory, literally has every pixel of what they see in memory, and no one does. That's never been shown. People are always grabbing little bits and pieces of their environment. But somebody with HSAM would be often colloquially called someone with a photographic memory because they remember so much.
Interesting. So for us, if this idea of forgetting things to save, whether it's bandwidth so that we can optimize for survival and present moment, if that's the majority of us, what's going on inside the person that has exactly what I forgot what it, how do you chart it? Highly superior autobiographical memory. That's a hard word. So what's going on inside?
I just say HSAM.
HSAM, way easier. Yeah. What's going on inside those folks from like an evolutionary perspective if they are remembering every single thing more vividly than others?
Yeah, we don't know. It's pretty recent when mainstream memory research started to acknowledge that this even exists. And we don't know what's going on in the brains of these individuals. My suspicion is that part of it is they have an unusual motivation to mentally document their lives. And what the evolutionary pressure is on that, I don't know. But essentially, they tend to be people who journal, although that doesn't explain their memory. It tends to be kind of something that happens a lot. They tend to be a little bit compulsive or obsessive compulsive in terms of like having everything super organized and orderly. So, it may be kind of related to other traits that are related to anxiety and so forth. But I should emphasize, for the most part, when you look at their brains, they look like regular brains. When you ask them to memorize a whole lot of things that have nothing to do with them, they're not superior. When you try to trick them, they will often generate false memories. So they're not perfect. It's just kind of a variation in the general human experience that we don't understand exactly why.
Yeah, I thought because of the term photographic memory that these people can literally remember the colors, what expression you had at that moment. And this is why I love speaking with experts like yourself, particularly in the idea of memory, because we always have these misconceptions around the stories we tell around memory. What do you think some of those most common misconceptions are that society has and most people have around how memory works generally in our brains?
So let me first just go back and say, I should say they can be very visual, the HSAM people. Sorry about that. I just wanted to go backwards because I realized I might have been a little misleading because one of your listeners might be like, well, I have this and I'm really visual, right? So they can visualize often in high detail, and people who have very poor autobiographical memory often also have a condition called aphantasia, where they can't see visual images in their mind at all. So there seems to be a link between that ability to visualize and autobiographical memory. Why that is, we don't know. But it's not photographic in the sense of like a photograph captures everything that's in front of a camera. And human memory generally doesn't. The closest I can think of is there's people who are on the autistic spectrum. And some of these people are called memory savants. And there's like some people, one person I can think of, I think his name is Stephen Wiltshire. He's in England, and he could go in a helicopter and fly over a city and then generate a gigantic painting of the cityscape from what he saw. And it's almost like looking at a photo, right?
Wow.
Not completely, but it is almost that way. So anyway, so that is, but he's again, not ridiculously successful. He's not super rich or anything like that. And he has a beautiful ability, and I don't know that everyone would want to trade places with him for that. Right. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt the flow. Maybe you can cut some of that around.
No, that's great.
But let's get back to your question. Do you want to ask it again about the misconceptions?
Yeah. What are some of the most misconceptions that people have around memory and how it works?
I think the biggest misconception people have is that we're supposed to remember everything and it's supposed to be easy. And neither of those are true. People's memory is extraordinarily incomplete. We forget really quickly. Within less than a day, you could forget 60% of the details of what you remembered, right? And even memories of events that you experience very vividly, you won't spend, like, let's say you remember a picnic that went on for 2 hours and you had a lot of fun, and you tell one of your relatives about how much fun you had. you're not going to explain it for 2 hours. You're not going to hallucinate being in that event for 2 hours. If you spend more than 10 minutes describing what happened out of this 2-hour event, that would be an extraordinarily detailed memory, right? So in that sense, we know that memory is incomplete. Everybody knows that, and everybody has this. Everybody forgets, right? So then the question is, and that's why I wanted to title my book, Why We Remember, because if we forget so much, why do we even have this ability in the first place, right? And that was the thinking. And the second part about it being easy, I think, especially as we get older, it's frustrating, but in part that frustration comes from the fact that we assume that remembering should just come to us very quickly and it should be easy. And to some extent, when you're a teenager or a young adult, that may be true, but it often requires a lot of intention to actually start off by saying, what's important to me from this moment that I want to carry with me? And then you can use all these strategies and tools, some of which I describe in my book, but I can't help anyone if they think that this stuff should just automatically pop into their head. It's not like as if you eat enough blueberries and ginkgo supplements that all of a sudden you'll just easily remember anything that you need.
Yeah, I was thinking about that relationship between why we remember things based on survival and in order to function in the world, and the correlation between why someone that's younger perhaps might remember more things in the short term. So for example, like if you're in your 30s or 40s, I would imagine that you've already had enough experience in the world to understand how to survive, to not touch the stove, to speak to someone in a certain way. So you've kind of evolved to already learn how to survive in the world of at least presently in the first 10 to 20 years versus someone that is 10 years old, someone like my niece perhaps that's 5 years old. Everything is so important because they're learning every single thing every day, and that might be a new survival instinct for them. So how much of that is the reason why people that are older struggle with short-term memory versus the actual brain and our ability to remember things?
Well, I would say that you can't reverse engineer evolution too well, or at least I can't. So it's very hard to say from the way people behave what exactly could have happened. But the fact is, even when you're an adult, or even like, say middle-aged, you still need to learn a lot of things because the world changes, right? So you never truly have everything that you need at your disposal. If I have to remember to go get the groceries or something, actually, I forgot to get the groceries this week. So if I have to remember to get the groceries, that requires memory. If I have to learn my way around a new neighborhood that I'm visiting, that requires memory. There's so many things, I'm going to work one day and I all of a sudden see that the bike path I usually take is closed. I can use memory to adjust and adapt, right? So we need memory throughout much of our lifespan. I have kind of a pet idea that I like. It's not my idea per se, but it's one I really like, which is that when you get much older, like let's say you're past your years of being able to have a baby or something like that, or you're past your fertility years and so forth, and you're kind of older, a lot of species don't actually survive much past that, right? Humans are one species, orcas are another, as it turns out, that can survive past those fertility years. And so then the question you have to ask is why? What's the benefit in the sense of passing on your genes, right? And to me, I've found it very compelling to think that when you look at traditional societies, older people aren't focused on themselves. They're actually focused on the village. They're actually focused on their kin, grandchildren, and so forth. and passing on the knowledge and traditions that they already have, passing on their memories, essentially, right? And so I do think that to some extent, the natural biological shift that we see away from episodic memory, that ability to remember events and form new memories for events, might well be related to the mode that people need to be in when you're much older. Semantic memory, which is your knowledge about the world, remains unchanged as people get older. And that ability to share semantic memory is a huge part of what older people do in most societies. I think it's unfortunate that, at least in the United States, I don't know that we place much value on the knowledge that older people have, but we should. And I think people would be certainly much happier with their brains if they were doing that.
Could you quickly go over what semantic knowledge is for people that don't know?
Yeah. So semantic knowledge would be something like I ask you what a dinosaur is. You've never seen a dinosaur. You've never like played with a dinosaur. You have no life events that involve dinosaurs directly, but you've learned about dinosaurs in school, or you've seen movies and maybe even played with toy dinosaurs or something like that, right? So you have this knowledge from all of these different experiences that you can describe to me about what dinosaurs are like. Well, they're reptiles and they went extinct because of some great asteroid or comet. I can't remember. I think it was an asteroid. But anyway, so you can see the limits of my semantic knowledge right there. I can ask you about something more abstract like justice. What does that mean to you? And you can tell me something about that, right? Now, some of that might be informed by some experience you have with the law or something like that, but a lot of it would just be this kind of knowledge that you have about the world, right? So the psychologist Endel Tulving, who came up with the distinction between episodic and semantic memory, he kind of said essentially that semantic memory is kind of something that you retrieve in the third person. It's not something that you have experienced. It's something that you just know it exists, you know. But on the other hand, when we remember something episodically, we go back to some life event, it always involves some first person experience. It involves, I did this, I saw this, and so forth.
Got it. So and I'm sure you do as well. I know people that are quite young. To the point where like it's unlikely they're having cognitive issues at that age. You know, someone that's in their 20s or early 30s that have a very hard time with remembering things in the short term. It's almost funny. Like someone would ask you the same question like 7 times. And I always wonder, like, what's going on there? Is this a lack of presence in some ways when they're going through experiences, or where they're thinking about the future or the past instead of being in the present, that doesn't allow them to remember it, despite being at a young age where the brain should be at pretty peak performance?
I think you're right on. I mean, there's a number of reasons why that might happen, but I think you've laid out quite a few of them. I actually, when I was a kid, I was diagnosed with ADHD. It was the 70s, so they just called it hyperactivity, and they just moved on. Nothing was done about it. And it was years later where I started to really think about this. But this happens to me all the time. I'll be in the middle of conversations, and if it's not a one-on-one kind of intense conversation like we're having, I'll be in outer space, and then I come back a minute later and I have to catch up, and I'm like, what the heck was going on? You know? Now, I don't believe that ADHD is now spreading that much more than it used to be, but I think that it's like people, especially the younger people you described, have grown up in an age of screens. You know, they've grown up with screens on TV, on tablets, on phones, on watches. And I think that that way of interacting with the world makes it a lot more tempting to shift constantly, to shift between email and text messages and video games and all these things that are out there. And one of the theories, and this is something I'm going to write about in my next book, but one of the theories on kind of being able to focus and control your attention, one of the theories is that, well, your brain has all of these different competing motivations that could be used to grab your attention, right? And so your brain ultimately has to settle on one thing and go with it. But even in the background, you'll be able to see these other kinds of possibilities come up. So if I have my phone in front of me, I always have a reminder, a cue that says, hey, I could be talking on the phone right now. Or I could be texting, or I could be looking at Instagram and so forth. If I have a watch and that watch is buzzing periodically, that's going to grab my attention. And so there are so many things in our environment now, and kind of habits that we pick up too because of these things in our environment that will pull us away from the present.
Yeah, we also had a ADHD researcher on, and I believe he said that a lot of adults, it looks like a lot of ADHD is growing, especially in adults, but a lot of them were just not diagnosed in the first place, because a lot of children will get diagnosed and have a protocol to do that, but adults were generally not until quite recently. So, which kind of, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that I definitely think there's truth to that. And especially, I think women have been underdiagnosed, which is really unfortunate. I also think, though, that right now there's a lot of people who are suffering from the symptoms of ADHD because of the environments they're in and the context they're in. And the big difference meaning they could leave those contexts and leave those environments or change those environments and gain a lot of those abilities back. The other difference being that there's some benefits to having an ADHD brain. I don't think if you're just surrounding yourself with media devices that can constantly grab your attention, you're getting the costs with none of the benefits.
Yeah, that's a good sign, right? It's empowering, at least, to see that some of these people that have symptoms of ADHD don't actually have ADHD, but perhaps they just are overstimulated by modern technology, which happens to all of us these days.
Yeah. And building habits that sort of encourage us to do that, right? Like the more you shift between talking and checking emails and texting and so forth, the more you get used to that, and the harder it is to pull out of that, the harder it is to get out of that habit. I will basically find myself, if I'm getting bored of whatever it is I'm doing, which happens quite often, the first thing I'll do is I'll look at Facebook, or I'll check email, or I'll look at Instagram. Clearly people 30 years ago didn't have those things. They didn't have Instagram. They didn't have Facebook. Yeah, they had email, but maybe they weren't so attached to it as they are now. Right. So I think that, a lot of those habits that we get into are really hard to get out of once we build those behaviors in. And so I've put like a timer on my thing that says that after, 10 minutes, it doesn't let me open Instagram, or like I've removed the Facebook app from my phone. It's not perfect. I still check email way more than I should, but I think sometimes you just have to put speed bumps to just make sure that you get it back on track quickly.
Right. It's that notion that our brains are a million years old, but modern technologies and the constant stimulus it's quite recent. We're talking decades rather than millions of years. I'm curious, just as a side tangent, to get your thoughts on like how adaptable our brains are through generations. If our generation and the previous generation and then the next 5-6 generations continue to grow up with technology, social media, and overstimulation, can the brain eventually adapt over generations to be able to handle more stimulation compared to the ancestors that grew up millions of years ago?
I would say that could be possible if like somehow there were some selective advantage in terms of survival or reproduction. But it's hard for me to see some advantage that people would have from essentially being able to adapt. But I also think that we are adapted to some extent to technology now. It's just the thing is that we have other voices that tell us that we shouldn't be as adapted to the technology. In other words, our brains are perfectly well adapted to deal with lots of stimulation. But the problem is that the choices we make in terms of directing our attention, in terms of directing our cognition, aren't necessarily aligned with our big goals, right? So those goals might not be, I want to be as productive as possible, but those goals also might not be, I want to check Facebook as much as possible. I want to get as many likes as possible.
Yeah.
And so I think that you might see something along the lines of having more cognitive control, that ability to be able to direct your plans and your attention, your working memory, so to speak, to be able to direct those abilities towards what your long-term goals are as opposed to what's immediately in front of you. The more you're able to do that, the more you will be able to flexibly navigate this complicated world. So it's not so much, in my opinion, it's not so much about not having the ability to deal with too many things, but rather not being able to direct cognitive control to focus on the things that matter to you. I mean, for the most part, I don't know that we even think about the things that matter to us. And it sounds a little odd to say that, but it's really like you can ask yourself, okay, why am I doing this podcast? What is my long-term benefit out of that, right? What's my long-term benefit out of clearing out my inbox? What's my long-term, it's just going to get full again, right? And so this kind of goes back to that idea of intention, which is really to kind of start with your goals. And I found actually one of my hacks for helping with the ADHD thing is in the morning, I write down things that I want to do in the day. And that really helps me just realize that there's some things out there that I need to do, but I also will get some benefit out of doing them, right? Because a lot of the things that grab us are things that give us some kind of a small immediate reinforcement. Things like Facebook, even though it's silly, if you do a post and you get a like, we have this kind of deep motivational drive for social approval and social status, right? And so we have to compensate for that by sort of adding a load onto the things that we really want to do and think about, why do I want to do it and what benefit do I get out of it? Because those are things that require more of a long-term investment in time.
Right. And that's the issue with instant validation that we get with social media. If we're triggered to remember or at least have those good feelings with short-term gratification, then it is very hard for most people to be able to make those long-term investments. I was just thinking back around why most people may not remember these short-term things is because they're probably distracted either on their phones. And it kind of gives me, it makes me think about the relationship between stress and emotion and how that correlates with memory. Can you kind of elaborate more on those two relationships?
Yeah. So I think if most of your listeners think about the events in their life that they can remember, like if you just ask almost anyone to pull up a memory from their past, it'll be something that was associated with some kind of emotional experience. Often they're pleasant ones, they're happy ones. I have a pretty spotty memory from my childhood, but when I remember something, it tends to be something that was happy. But I can also remember the things that were embarrassing or moments where I really lost it and had a tantrum or something like that. And times when I was really scared. And again, this goes back to that biological argument, which is those emotions are associated with very clear motivational circuitry in our brain that helps us go, okay, well, I want to chase rewards. I want to be liked. I need to be liked. I need to chase rewards. I need to avoid threats, avoid predators. And so those emotions that we have are associated with chemicals in our brain like dopamine, serotonin, noradrenaline, cortisol that are released. And those chemicals actually promote plasticity. They promote new memories to stick around, right? So if you have a stressful experience, you will be more likely to remember that experience because those stress hormones and the chemicals that are released in your brain will promote plasticity and what's called memory consolidation, which is essentially the ability to have a new memory and make it stick so that it's more lasting and robust over time, right? So that's good in a way. You could say, oh, well, that's nice, but that's also why people will remember traumas very intensely. The other part of it is that when we're stressed, we're able to form new memories pretty well, but we're not able to remember old memories very well when we're in that mode. Also, when we're stressed, what we pay attention to is what we're stressed out about. So you don't get everything. It's not like a photographic memory. You really kind of get a contrast effect where the things that are most significant in the environment will stick out to you. Anything that could be a threat or anything that just seems out of place. That's the stuff that you tend to remember much better when you're in this kind of highly emotional state. So stress, it's a very complicated thing. And you even see these levels that people have where it's like a certain amount of stress is good for memory. And in general, that can be true. You know, if you have no motivation to do anything, like if you just don't care at all, then you're not going to perform very well in terms of memory things. But if you have some degree of stress, a moderate degree, that can actually help you. But when you go over the edge, the prefrontal cortex, which is this area of the brain that's super important for what I've just called cognitive control, that those executive functions, it just gets shut down basically. So with immediate stress, you become much more focused on what's in the moment and less able to think about the big picture over time. And that also makes it harder to remember. In addition to that, if you have chronic stress, like let's say you live in a very abusive home, the chronic release of these stress-related hormones can be toxic to brain areas that are important for memory, like the hippocampus and like the prefrontal cortex. And that is extremely bad and might be related to some of the memory dysfunction that you see in people with post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah, because that was my distinction that I was going to ask you is people that have traumatic events or childhood. I've seen both sides, and perhaps you just made the distinction is that some people do have extremely vivid memories of this traumatic experience. They can almost like a photographic memory for that specific event that's happened. Yet some people on the other end have zero memory. It's almost like a survival instinct for their brain not to remember some of the negative experiences. And I just wanted to kind of elaborate more on like, what is the difference there for people that have completely different experiences with traumatic events and memory?
Well, you know, it's interesting because on average, people who have experienced traumas remember those traumas really well. There's not any evidence to suggest that there's some kind of a repression mechanism where the brain is trying to shut down memory for a traumatic experience. If anything, and you could say this like the survival thing you mentioned, it's really important to remember the things that are stressful, right? It's like if you get attacked by a bear, you should remember that. And you shouldn't remember that just so that you can keep reliving this bear attack. You should remember it so that you don't go back to that cave again. You don't make the same mistake twice, right? So that's why we have this enhancement in memory for traumatic events. Now, some people may try to push it out of their mind, and they can do it well enough that they can actually inhibit their ability to access that memory. So a friend of mine, Mike Anderson, has done a lot of research on this topic. Sometimes people will have the traumatic memory, but it becomes kind of diffused over time. Matt Walker, who studies sleep, has argued that what happens during sleep is these emotional memories are reprocessed, and the kind of the visceral immediacy of those traumas just kind of gets pulled away, and as the brain starts to accommodate just information about what happened, you sort of throw out the emotional experience of it. And so some people have that, and then it's like, if they're not in the place and time where it happened, they just don't remember it well because they don't have that context as a reminder. Just like you might not remember something that you did in the summertime when you were a teenager, unless you hear a song that just brings you back to that time and place, right? So sometimes people just need the right reminder. It's also conceivable, like we were talking about, that somebody has so much chronic stress that their ability to remember almost anything just declines. And we don't know, but it's possible that if you just have an extreme arousal, extreme stress, that maybe even if it's just for like one event, that maybe that can cause some kind of amnesia. There are these cases of people, I guess it's like the closest I could think of is two things. One is there's a phenomenon of what's called Taylor Swift amnesia, where all these Swifties would go to the Eras tour and reported having no memory of the experience. And so some people say, well, that's because the stress response was so off the charts that it just obliterated their memory.
Interesting.
It's possible. There's also people who have what's called fugue. And so these experiences these are specific things that happen to people where they experience some very stressful event and then they just pop up somewhere and they have no memory of who they are or what brought them there. And so there's some kind of intense thing that happens in the brain that leads them to dissociate and lose access to all of these memories that happen to them. It's so rare, we don't know why it happens. But in the science that has been done, it looks like most of those people have some kind of a stressful experience.
Right. And then it just really highlights the fact that there's such an overlap of imagination, kind of this made up story that we have in our head, than the actual memory itself. And I'm wondering if there's a lesson there, if at the end of the day, whatever we try to remember is a version, maybe a biased version of what actually happened. Could we use that as an advantage to, in a deliberate way, like visualization, to put a positive spin on perhaps what was once a traumatic event or what once debilitated some aspect of our lives?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And that's something I'm a big advocate for. I like to say memory is not like a photograph, it's like a painting. And paintings have some elements that are true. They have some elements that are distorted, and there's some elements that just reflect your perspective. You might decide to paint a picture of a church that is happening at night in kind of an eerie moonlight, or you might portray that painting. You might do that painting on a beautiful sunny day with flowers everywhere, right? And both of those paintings are valid. Neither of them would be a false painting, but they're very different depending on the perspective of the painter, right? And every time we remember, we're sort of painting a new picture of what happened. You can look at the same event in many different perspectives, many different ways. And there's actually research showing if I change the way I look at the same event, I can remember things that I didn't remember before. If you go back to a past event and you try to recall it from the perspective of someone else who was watching it, you may well remember some things that didn't pop out the first time around. And I think this is why therapy is so valuable for people who experience traumas, because really what a lot of insight-oriented therapy is, whether it's psychoanalysis or even cognitive therapy, a lot of what really happens is processing memories, where you describe something to me. And I know because I did this when I was doing my clinical training. And so you described to me this terrible event that happened to you. And I, as an observer, take those pieces and I might try to put them together from a different perspective and see them in a different way and ask you how that sounds to you. And through this process of collaborating, we start to paint a new picture of what happens with information that's emphasized in a very different way and a new story that you can put onto that same memory. And so as a result, you can actually literally change your memories, but not change them in the sense of deleting a memory for a trauma, but rather change them in the sense of being able to reframe and generate a story. Because I think another big misconception people have is that their memory is an objective record of what happened. And in fact, when we remember, we do have these little bits and pieces that are true to what happened, but the story we put together is very, very different from that. And that story is subject to change, and we can emphasize certain bits and we can de-emphasize other bits.
Yeah, and this reminds me kind of the role that dreams play in our memory. Like there are dreams that I have that are so vivid, and all of a sudden it would be someone that I haven't thought about in 20 years that would just come up in memory, and it's so vivid. And the memories that I had with them start to overlap with the dream, and I don't know which one was real in some ways. You know, one of my favorite movies is Inception. I'm sure this is probably, well, you might be a critic of it just because of the unrealistic aspect of it, but
Well, it's fun.
yeah, it's just so fascinating because it puts a visual illustration of like how you can hack into someone's dream to actually reform their memory. Just based on all of this, like what is the role of dreams and how can that reconstruct the memories that we have?
Well, again, we don't know for sure. There's a lot of ideas and there's some data, but it's still really an evolving story. The story that we have right now, or at least the one I like a lot, is that our memories get rearranged during sleep, and that dreams are a big part of that process. So one idea that's out there, I think Anna Shapiro at Penn has basically incorporated this into a model that we have some stages of sleep that are called non-REM sleep, which are or slow wave sleep, which are those moments where you're deeply conked out. And during those stages of sleep, memories for particular parts of experiences may be strengthened, and other parts may be just dumped and lost. But then during rapid eye movement sleep, which is named because people start to make lots of eye movements, and they tend to move around more. That's a period where we know people have dreams, and we know because if you wake them up from REM sleep, they will be able to tell you their dream. And so during REM sleep, what may be happening is that we have all these memories from different events, and our brain starts to free associate them and throw little elements of different memories together and see what sticks, basically, and try to synthesize all of those episodic memories into some semantic knowledge about the world, right? So I hang out with you sometime and you get in, let's say you get an India Pale Ale or something like that. And then later on, I kind of hang out with you, you get like some fruit flavored beer or something like that. And at some point I might build up some knowledge about you that you like craft beers. And the point being is that any one of these experiences doesn't tell me that. But through this process of throwing together multiple events, I might be able to piece together that you have this this fact about you, so to speak. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. And it it does get confusing, and the reality is like REM sleep happens later in the night, right? So deep sleep, I believe, happens in the beginning, and then the majority of the REM sleep happens later at night. Which means if you get woken up in a dream, like I was dating someone, and at one point apparently I did something in the dream, and then she was mad at me for like the whole day, just because in that moment I was doing something, and then she woke me up and she couldn't really tell between the emotions she had in the dream and real life, right? So it's so fascinating how that has evolved. Another another thing that I've been fascinated with since I was a kid is déjà vu moments. And people have different conceptions. People think it's this connection with a past life that kind of happened in a parallel universe, whereas some people think it's a glitch in the simulation that we live in. A lot of theories
there's
behind
a lot of
it.
tech CEOs who like that idea.
I'm sure, right? And we kind of choose the story that we want anyways. So yeah. But from a neuroscience perspective, what does that suggest? What is happening in the brain during a déjà vu experience? And are there times that déjà vu is more common, such as when we're stressed or when we're more fatigued and so forth?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that déjà vu is this strong sense that you've experienced something before, even though you kind of have a knowledge that you haven't, right? So there's two parts of this. One is this familiarity, this overwhelming sense of a memory, and this other knowledge that the memory isn't there, or a feeling like there's no information that's coming back to you. It's just the sense of a memory without actually any data to prove it, right? And so to some extent, you might have this if you see a person's face and you're like, I know I've seen them before, but I have no memory of how or why. And it might even be like you go to a new place and you're like, I know I've never been here before, but I feel like I've been here before. There's some strong sense that I've been here. It's really weird, right? And so we know that this is related to phenomena that happens in the brain, because some of the early depictions of epilepsy, what some neurologists found, Hewlings Jackson was one of the early neurologists who documented this, is that patients with epilepsy will sometimes have this intense sense of déjà vu right before they have a seizure. And so there's this electrical activity that's happening near these centers in the temporal lobes of the brain that are important for memory. And that electrical activity will stimulate this intense sense of remembering without actually any content, right? Later on, we found that, in fact, you could stimulate parts of the temporal lobes and people would artificially get the sense of déjà vu. And so now we've, in some of my research and other people's research, we identified areas of the temporal lobes, like an area called the perirhinal cortex, where activity is related to that sense of familiarity, that overwhelming sense of something has happened before. And a colleague, Ann Cleary, actually, this is one of my big regrets in the book, is that I didn't know about her research on this topic when I wrote the book. But Ann's got this beautiful experimental approach where she can make people feel déjà vu. Wow. And what she does is she has people in virtual reality go through these places. Let's say it might be a video arcade, and you go through and you navigate through the video arcade. Well, one of the cool things about virtual reality is you can take basically the same place and put a different skin on it. And so what she did was she would take that video arcade and remove anything about it that was related to video games, and instead made it a museum. And so people are walking through a place. The statues that were there used to be video game things. The walls are a different color. The lighting is different. But people will report this intense sense of déjà vu, where they will be like, I know I've not been to this museum before in virtual reality, but I feel like I have. And so what seems to be happening again is there's enough of something out there in the world to trigger some sense of familiarity. There's just a match between what you're seeing or what you're experiencing and an experience you've had before. but it mismatches enough that you're short circuiting that and you're not recalling an actual memory from it.
Got it. So it's not real. You're saying you're going to disappoint a lot of people.
I mean, it's a real signal that happens in your brain, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's kind of interesting because the entire act of remembering, is that real or not? You mentioned this idea of remembering a dream. Well, you had the dream, so it was a real dream, right? But the key is that when you remember that dream, it's not something that actually happened in the physical world. It's something that just happened in your head. And so that's the interesting thing about memory, is you can remember all sorts of things that you've never done. They can just be things that you've thought about. And we can have all of these experiences that are triggering something in the memory system, but we know they're experiences that we haven't had, but they have some kind of a obscure link with things that we've experienced.
And what do you think is the function of that? I mean, is there something that our brain is trying to tell us, especially when we get back into the reason why we forget things is because of certain prioritization of survival? If we're being triggered a memory that's trying to convince us that we've had something like this before, does that mean that perhaps we're in a stressful situation or a dangerous situation, which is why your brain is saying, hey, like, remember this has happened before?
Well, I think that first of all, it is pretty adaptive to not remember having been in a place if you've never been in that place, right? So in other words, the fact that you have deja vu in some sense is a success, because you haven't been there before. And so unless you have deja vu for something that you actually have experienced, like I see someone's face and I go, I know I've seen them before, and it turns out that you have, well, if that happens, then yeah, that can be thought of as memory failure. But often we have that sense where we didn't remember something. So that's actually kind of an example of the success of episodic memory, right? But that sense of familiarity is something else altogether. And me and my colleagues, it's a very controversial idea, but we think that what's happening is that the brain is effectively tuning itself up to process things more efficiently. And that can happen even independent of the ability to remember any one event, right? So in other words, every time I come into this room, which is my home office, my brain will tune itself up to adapt to the things that are regularly here. The table is in this position, the guitars are hanging on that wall, and so forth. And so as a result, I'll use less energy and more quickly produce information about what's in front of me right now. It also allows me to kind of focus on the things that don't fit. It allows me to focus my energy on what's new as opposed to what's the same. And that's very adaptive, right? If there's something that's out there in the world and it hasn't changed in the last 20 years, there's no point in paying attention to it. But it's the stuff that changes that you really want to pay attention to. That's the most informative, whether it's a threat or whether it's a reward or anything, right? And so this ability to kind of distinguish really quickly between things that are familiar and things that aren't familiar is very adaptive. But where it gets thrown into a bad situation is we can be exposed to misinformation, and the more times we're exposed to it, the more true it seems, right? Or you see an advertisement while you're on some, on your favorite social media site, and you see it over and over again, and this product seems a little bit more like something you need, or some influencer keeps popping up in your feed, and at some point you feel like that's a famous person who has something useful to say. And so again, that sense of familiarity is sort of making them seem less threatening or make it seem more easy to process. And so that's where that sense of familiarity can really take us in wrong directions.
Yeah, just based on my personal experience, I feel when I was young, like between 7 to early teens, I had way more deja vu moments than I can remember. Perhaps compared to, if I think about the last 10 years, like it's a handful. But I visit, like I like really remember having that moment, many moments when I was younger. So what does that mean? Knowing that now I don't have these deja vu moments, what does that say about my brain or how I'm living my life?
I guess what I would say is that it could be because now your memories are more specific. And so, to some extent, you're less likely to match up places you've been with places that you're experiencing now for the first time. You're less likely to think of faces that you're seeing relative to faces that you've seen before.
Mm.
And so, the more expertise we build on the world, the more we're able to tune our feature detection, so to speak, to tune our attention, to tune our perception, to tune up the way we look at the world in a way that kind of grabs the most important information and throws out the less useful information. Because sometimes what can happen is there's information that's not very useful that comes in and activates information in our memory, right? So if you are, let's say, a chess expert, you could watch 2 matches of chess and be like, well, that doesn't match up with anything I've seen before. But on the other hand, like if you're a novice, that like those 2 chess matches might seem exactly alike and like every other chess match you've seen.
Interesting. Yeah, I like that explanation. I want to get tactical for people listening here. Based on the latest research in science, what are the most powerful habits people can adopt to improve memory retention and recall, whether that's long-term memory or short-term memory? And you can kind of provide both if they're different.
Yeah, no, what I would say is that at least for what people talk about as short-term memory, typically people think of that as being like, days or something that happened in the last week. In psychology, we'll talk about short-term memory as things that happened 5 seconds ago. So it's a little bit of a different thing. But let's say we take the real remembering what I did last Monday or remembering what I did last year or something like that. What I would say is, first of all, you have to start with some intention. What is it that I need to remember? What is it that I want to remember? So if it is that I need to remember to take out the trash, I should start with the intention. I should start by assuming I won't remember to take out the trash unless I do something about it, right? So unless I engage some strategy. And again, that intention pushes you to do something, right? So now I say, okay, I have to remember to take out the trash. I have to remember to get some cream at the grocery store or something like that, right? So now the next thing I can do is I can say, well, how the heck am I going to remember to do something in the future, right? That's the thing that hasn't happened yet. How can I have a memory for it? But you can generate a memory for something that you haven't done, as we've talked about, right? So you can imagine yourself doing it. I can imagine myself going home. I can imagine myself seeing the shades open and looking at the monitor of my computer in my home office. Or I could imagine looking at the lavender that's growing by the front of the house and seeing that and then having that remind me. I mean, I could even go further and imagine, let's say if I had a garden gnome in front of my house, I could imagine the gnome telling me, hey, go take out the garbage. And before I turn that key in the doorway, I'm going to pull it back out and imagine myself walking over and touching the garbage can and wheeling it over to the curb, right? Next time you come home, that memory will just pop into your head because you're in that place, you're doing that thing, you're seeing all those reminders in front of you, and it will just turn on the memory like a light bulb, right? So for remembering to do things in the future, the best way to do that is to kind of say, well, what's going to be there? What are the reminders that are going to be in that environment? And then actually imagine using those cues to do the thing that you're supposed to be doing. And that's a really helpful thing, I find, right? There's other kinds of memory problems which have to do more with things like remembering someone's name. And two things I think that are super helpful are, one is testing yourself on it. And this is true for almost anything. Active learning is really good for you, as opposed to just, again, expecting to get the memory for free. So if I come into a room and I expect to remember the names of the people I meet, I should do something about that. So maybe what I'll do is I will guess the person's name before they say it. And you don't necessarily have to do it out loud. You could do it in your head. But it turns out that if you test yourself on something, even before you've learned it, it will help you remember it better. So if I were to look at you and say, well, I think your name is, just random. Let's say your name is John or something, and then you introduce yourself and say, I'm Sean. Well, now if I really think about your name and go, oh, it's Sean, not John. Well, now my brain can actually repair the memory that I've just created to remove John altogether and emphasize Sean, right? And so that helps me remember it better. We've simulated this with computer models, and it's remarkably effective. And later on, I can say, oh, yeah, that was a great conversation I had with Sean. And now I had to struggle to pull that information up. And again, my brain can repair the memory to make it easier to access the next time around. So that's a really good thing to do, is to test yourself even before you've learned something, and definitely after, right? So you're in a new place and you're trying to get to the grocery store. You could try guessing where you're going to turn before you look at the GPS to tell you where to turn. And then later on, when you get to the grocery store, you could say, okay, well, how did I get here? And try to test yourself on it, and then look at the map to give you the feedback, right? So that process of kind of struggling and then getting the right answer is super helpful.
In terms of names, I've heard a story that like Bill Clinton was one of he had this amazing talent of being able to remember everyone's name whenever he would go to a party. And apparently what he would do, he would just repeat back the name as soon as he would meet you. So we would say, nice to meet you, John or Dave. And he would, my name is Dave, and he'll repeat back right away. Is that immediate usage something that you would recommend as well? As soon as you try to remember something, try to use it or try to apply it in some way. This could be, I guess, relevant for language learning, particularly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Especially applying it, so you're not just literally just repeating what they just said, but you're putting it into a new context, a new sentence. And that will require much more heavy lifting in memory. And the more you do that heavy lifting, the more you build up the muscle to retrieve it easier the next time around. So I think that's a perfect way to describe how you should do it. Now, some people are going to be better than others. Some people are very good at distinguishing between people's faces. Some people are very good at distinguishing names and naturally being able to do that. Some people have more social motivation. They're really extroverted and they want to, so their brains are really going to release gobs of dopamine when they are meeting someone. And so there's that too. And sometimes what it is also, there's kind of an interesting finding in the field, and it's not very well explained. But usually if you have too much information to memorize, it's really bad. Like if I'm trying to memorize 10 people's names, I'm going to do worse than if I have to memorize one name, right? But it turns out if I know other facts about you, it'll make it easier to remember your name. So if I know that your name is Sean and I know you like to go skiing and I know that you have a pet turtle and all of these facts, and I know you are a podcaster, I know about your podcast, the more knowledge that I have, the easier it is to lock on this new name to all of that other knowledge, right? And it's why people who are super baseball experts, you could create a player that never existed and give statistics for this player, and people, the baseball experts, will be able to remember their name and remember those statistics better than if you just gave them the name by itself. So having some kind of a slot that you can put people into and having this network of associations you can plug in with the name really helps a lot too.
What about the tip of the tongue effect? You know, when you're having a conversation with someone and then you're trying to remember whether it is a person's name or whether it's a certain fact or book that you were talking about, and it's like right on that tip of your tongue. Everybody, I'm sure, had that experience before. But for me, when I try to think about actively what that is, it's actually harder to recall versus if we just continue talking after a while. Perhaps there's something you mentioned that connects me with whatever it is. I don't know if maybe it's my physical state that like I'm just less stressed and because of that I can remember more. What is that effect and how can we, I mean, I guess what is the relationship between that and being able to remember when something is kind of at that tip of the tongue, and how can we recall those things more easily when we need to?
Well, so first off, I find the evidence for the tip of the tongue effect that's most compelling is the evidence suggesting that we often retrieve the wrong thing. So when you're trying to pull up information from memory, there's this competition in your brain of all these different memories that could come up. Sometimes you pull up the wrong thing, and that wrong thing then becomes so active in our minds that it pushes away the competition. It pushes them down and dampens the other possibilities. And so the problem is if you come up with the wrong thing, even though you know it's wrong, it actually makes it harder to recall the right answer. And so if somebody doesn't give it to you, then you've got a real problem on your hands, right? And so it's only putting yourself into a new context, a new place and time, where what happens is that wrong information is no longer active. And so it's why we can struggle to remember something in the moment and then an hour later recall it easily without any work. And it's, but we no longer need that information anymore. So that's one of the reasons, at least, why that effect happens. And so that's why sometimes it's better to just let it go. When I have that tip of the tongue effect, I just immediately let it go, because sometimes what can happen is you get stuck and you keep going back over and over to the wrong answer. And every time you do, it makes the problem worse and worse. And so what I try to do is kind of flush out what's going on in my mind at the moment so that I'm now going to be less likely to pull up the wrong answer.
Right. And yeah, I did find, just from my own experience, if I let it go, if I don't try to actively struggle to remember it, it'll just pop up. The answer would pop up in the end. So yeah, that's seems to be the case there. Speaking of struggle, you talk about in your book how there is value in struggling if we want to remember more. Can you talk about that a little bit and why we should seek pain, if we're trying to learn and remember more things?
Yeah, and it comes to what we find is that if you look at the tricks that involve essentially remembering more and remembering better, those tricks all require a certain degree of work, right? If you're trying to use a strategy to memorize people's names, well, that requires some work, right? But on top of that, the act of trying to remember something is in and of itself the best learning tool you can find. And the harder that learning is, the harder it is to remember something, once you get the right answer, you can get a huge benefit from that, right? So, and we can see it in our computer models, because what happens is that when you get the feedback of what the right answer is, well, now I can reduce the associations between the wrong answer and the cues that are in front of me, right? And this might seem very abstract, but if you think about it, nobody who's performing in a play would just look at the lines on the script and just try to memorize them. You'd actually put down the script and try to recall it, and then look at the script when you screw up the lines, right? And so that's the best way to memorize something, because now what you're doing is you're tuning up your brain to actually generate the right answer.
Interesting. Got it.
But that's hard, right? It's harder. It's embarrassing to practice for a play and say the wrong information. It's frustrating to sit here and feel the pain of not getting the right answer. But I think we can reframe that, right? So I know your podcast is called Growth Minds, and that's a big part of the growth mindset, is saying, yeah, remembering is hard, and this feeling that I have of struggle is part of the process of learning. I'm learning more. I'm not like actually, it's not that my memory is bad. It's a sign that I'm going through the process of learning.
Totally. Yeah. I'm in the language learning business, and this is really the core thesis of our app, is when we look at people that are not afraid to make mistakes and just willing to speak and get feedback and improve. They don't care about being embarrassed. They're the ones that tend to learn much faster, right? In any aspect, from the oral aspect to the vocab. So I think that's a great example of perhaps there is a correlation between people that are willing to struggle with higher perception of memory, at least. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, like if you try to rehearse those lines for a play and you forget a bunch of lines, if you just sit around and say, I did terrible. That was so bad, that's not going to be a good learning mechanism, as opposed to say, oh, that's the line. I need to think about that and be able to associate it with the other lines to be able to pull it up easier the next time around. Right. So a lot of that stuff that we do to beat ourselves up is actually super counterproductive. It actually takes a potential learning experience and throws it out the window, and in fact makes things harder for us the next time around. And so I really encourage people to kind of take this attitude of remembering should be hard and learning should be hard, but that feeling that it's hard is actually a good thing. It's not a bad thing.
Charan, I always like to kind of end on talking about the shift in technology, and particularly with this shift with AI and digital technology, and how that could impact our memory long term. When I see a lot of, especially Gen Z or millennials using AI, a lot of it is journaled. People have a conversation, they'll use it as a journal, whether it's through text or voice, which really allows us to offload a lot of our memory into the cloud that's there for us to access at any point. And we can create mind maps with it. And then you have social media, where 10 years ago or 12 years ago, you didn't have access to what you did on this exact date with a photographic visualization or video. And I'm just curious to know how you think that impacts our memory and what it's kind of evolved to do, when so much of our memory is now being offloaded from our brain to something that's visually accessible in the cloud.
Well, so I'm a big fan of offloading. I mean, if something can be offloaded, it's not necessary, right? So if you were to ask people to remember the phone numbers of people they know, nobody remembers them now because you can just activate them on your phone, right? So I think offloading in general can be good. I think where the problems, I think there are two key problems that I see. One is it's not so much the technology as what we do or don't do with it, right? So if like there's old research that back when Google searches were becoming a thing, what researchers found was when people were exposed to information that they searched for on Google as opposed to just seeing it, they would be more likely to remember the search terms they used than to remember what they actually got. So the memory that you have tends to be more about the process than the outcome. In the case of all these journaling and mind maps and stuff like that, the more automatic they are, essentially you're not doing that struggle. You're not working, right? And so in theory, that information gets put in the clouds and you can go back to it and you can go back to your social media feed and start putting together the thing. How many people actually have time to do that? You know, how many people actually put in the work to do that, have the interest to do that? What usually happens is people will offload it and they'll have this confidence that they'll remember it later because you've offloaded it. But then you just move on to something else. And so rather than, in fact, just working to form like a real memory on your own, you've offloaded it and created this crummy memory in the first place that even if you went back to the picture, you might not remember much of it because you weren't really mentally there for long enough to really do anything with it, right? I think like things like, you know, the Instagram story and, you know, these kinds of like disappearing memories that you get are ones that it's kind of a metaphor almost for our time that, you know, people will post these things and then they disappear and the memory disappears with them, right? So I think people have to use the technology as a memory tool for the things that they want to remember. I don't need to remember phone numbers if I have my phone, but maybe I need to remember certain people's phone numbers because in case of emergency, those are the people I would need to contact, right? If there's something that you need to remember, if there's something that you want to remember, I think you should offload very intelligently. You shouldn't assume that the offloading is going to take the place of your memory. You should offload strategically to pick the information that's going to be most effective at reminding you of the event. And you should go back to it and test yourself on it. Don't just passively look at it. And that, I think, is a great way to use these tools properly. Another thought that I have just to close that topic up is I think, especially with AI tools, I worry that sometimes the tail can wag the dog. And what I mean by that is, in theory, we would use AI tools to do what we want, but do them faster and more efficiently, right? So, example I always come back to is when Google introduced like autocomplete in their Gmail app. And so I'd be using Gmail and it started to complete entire sentences for me after the first few words. And what I've found is that maybe 2 times out of 10, it gets it right. Another 5 times out of 10, it puts in something that I say is clearly wrong. Then there's the other 3 times where it's not what I wanted to say, but it's close enough. And I say, okay, I'll go with that, right? So you start to use AI in that way. And what happens is eventually that seems like the way things should be. You will start to write more like what the AI tool suggests, as opposed to writing in your own way. Because what's happening is your brain is using that experience to make it seem more like the right way to do things. And so if you think about these AI writing tools, well, what are they doing? They're trained on the lowest common denominator, basically like everything that's on the internet. And so what I worry is that it's like your writing and my writing are different, and they should be because we've had different life experiences. We're unique people. But what I can see happening is people's preferences and people's styles becoming more and more homogenized because it's easier to produce those responses, because it's easier to go with whatever the AI assistant is telling you than to actually go with what is in your head.
Yeah, no, I totally agree there. And you can, what I worry is just the loss of style, the individual style and the quirks and the characters that people have. Because I know people that are using ChatGPT to talk to partners and for dating and professionally for sure. So you're at the end of the day, as it gets better and better and it gets more humanized, we're going to end up potentially in a world where the robots are just talking to the other robots. It's not even humans talking to humans anymore, right? Um, but it is a great reminder, as you mentioned, that we should struggle and put our own spin to using AI in a beneficial way. So, Charan, this has been great. Really appreciate you for coming on and sharing all your knowledge. I want to make sure people get your book, Why We Remember: Unlocking Memory's Power to Hold On to What Matters. And excited for the next book that you mentioned as a sneak peek that's to be coming out soon, hopefully. Where can people learn more about you, and where should people go to discover more?
Well, I have an Instagram called The Memory Doc. So The Memory Doc, all one word. But you can also find out information on my website, charanranganath.com, and sign up for a mailing list. I haven't actually sent anything on the list so far.
Okay.
You don't have to worry about getting spammed, but eventually I'll get around to that. And yeah, in the meantime, you can look at my website for pictures, event information, book information, and so forth.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for coming on, and appreciate everyone for tuning in. Cheers.
Thank you. All right.